Hello, and welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. As usual, I'm Tina. Today I'm doing my last video of 2025, and this is my stats video. So this is where I share a bunch of charts about all the books that I read this year, and I, at the end, kind of go into a bit of analysis about, what these stats mean for, the book industry. I don't know if that's even true, but it's the end of the year, and, I'm tired, so this is what this is going to be. So basically, I'm just going to tell you kind of what I read this year. So starting off, I read 99 books this year, which is kind of weird because that's exactly the same number of books I read last year. Except last year, I think this total included the DNFs that I did, where this year I forgot to track them. I just kind of removed them from my reading list when I didn't finish them, which I think was stupid for this video purposes. But anyway, so next year I will not do that. There were 4 or 5 or so, I think, that I DNF'd. Anyway, in total number of page count, that's 28,966 pages that I read according to Goodreads. And that includes audiobook pages as well. It's easier to just do it that way. I could remove all the audiobooks, but I don't think that's really fair. So, basically, I'm kind of looking off screen a little bit because I've got my charts and I've got to look at them so I can tell you the right information. But basically, books per month. I read 10 books in April, 6 in August, 6 in December, 6 in January, and then I read 8 in February, March, and November, and October, and then 9 in September, and 11 in June. So June was my best reading month. I think because, is that when, no, that's not even... See, it's interesting because, I don't count when I read them. I count when I reviewed them because it makes more sense for me in my tracking. So it actually makes more sense that I read more books in May because of the May the 4th Read With You readathon thing. So I probably read most of them in May, and then I recorded the reviews and stuff in June. And it makes sense that April was a big month, too, because isn't there a readathon then, too? Or maybe April's just, a good reading month for me. I don't know. So, yeah. So in terms of book formats, I read primarily ebook arcs because I get most of those books from NetGalley. So that's 45 ebook arcs, and that means that I got 45 books from NetGalley, which is fantastic. Thank you, NetGalley. I got arc paperbacks. I got 2. That's it. That's okay. I got 14 ebooks, and a good chunk of these, I think 11 of them were from the SPSFC. So there were 4 that I either bought or were given to me from someone else. I got a few mass market paperbacks, which is most of my classic sci-fi. I got 9 audiobooks and 16 paperbacks and then 2 hardcovers. So yeah, that's a pretty well-rounded if you don't count NetGalley, because NetGalley is a big chunk of what I read. And next we have books in terms of, so I'm Canadian. So how many books did I read that were Canadian authored? And there were 20 out of 99, which is really not that bad. So I read 79 books that were not Canadian and 20 that were. And then next is novellas. So I read 17 novellas and 82 full novels, which is kind of on par for what I usually do. I like novellas once in a while. They kind of ease the reading schedule. Next we have the amount in the years published. Trying to get this chart to work drove me crazy. I had to actually I couldn't figure it out in Excel. So I had to paste it into Paint and fix it. Anyway, so I read 63 books from 2024, which makes sense because I get so many arcs. I read, or did I screw this up? I screwed this up. That should say 2025. And then 2024 was 7 arcs. Oh my God, or 7 books. Anyway, obviously the majority were books that came out this year in 2025. I read a couple that came out next year. I read, for some reason, I read 4 in 2012, and then I read 11 from 1973 specifically, which is kind of funny. See, I don't think that's right, because I thought I read a bunch from 1976. Maybe I had that mixed up too. You know what? This chart might not match what I'm saying, but either way, most of the books I read were from this year, which makes sense. It's sad because normally I have 1 or 2 outliers from the 1800s, but I didn't get a chance to read any 1800s books this year. So I'm making that a goal for next year because I really love reading Victorian fiction. I don't know, I'm trying to fit it in. I've requested me things on NetGalley. Next is where I acquired these books from. So big surprise, most of them came from NetGalley. 47 of them, even though it says I read 45, which Okay. Oh, audiobooks. Yeah, okay. I got 2 audiobooks from NetGalley. So, okay. So I got 2 books from Amazon, probably BookBub, which I bought for $1. 8 from Audible directly because I have an Audible subscription. 4 from the author directly, 2 from the library. I got 14 from the publisher, so thank you so much to those publishers. 11 from the SPSFC, and 9 from used bookstores, and 2 were Christmas gifts that I got last year that I finally got around to reading in like September. Next we have series. I love this graph because it's ridiculous. 82 of the 99 books I read were standalone books. Clearly I have a preference. 11 were books 1 of a series. 4 of them were book 2 of a series, and then 2 of them were book 3 of a series. So clearly I'm not really a series person. I don't know. It's a commitment now to read a series. So I kind of really have to like a series. And of the ones that I did read, I think only 4 or 5 I wanted to like continue with the series after book 1. I can't remember what those are, but I made a note in my tracking when I was like, oh. Next is star ratings. So I don't really talk about stars too much on my channel because they're kind of arbitrary, but sometimes it's kind of fun. So I tend to give books higher stars on Goodreads and Amazon and stuff than they might merit, because I'm like, well, you know what, especially if they're like indie authors and stuff, I'm like, the difference between a 4 and a 5, it can actually really affect, especially if you only have like, say, like 20 reviews, it can really affect like your rating on those places. And I'm like, you know what, it doesn't hurt me to be a little nice, so I'll round up a 4 to 5 sometimes for like certain books. Big publishers no, but like little publishers, because I'm like, you know what, it's hard. It's really hard to sell books in this climate. So anyway, that might be disingenuous, but I don't care. Nothing on Goodreads is good anyway. Like, you know, all the review bombing and crap like that. Like, give me a break. So anyway, I gave 6% of the books I read this year 2 stars. That was maybe like 10 of them, and then, or maybe even like 6 of them. And then I gave, majority were for 4 stars, which was 34%, and then 3 stars was 30%, and then 5 stars was 30% as well. So, I mean, I'm a pretty high ranker, I would say, in terms of stars. And then publisher types. So I actually did a lot more work this year on this. So last year I was kind of like, oh, this is a small press, this is probably a big press, blah, 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 blah. But this year I went a bit deeper and did a bit more research on this. And, you know, if a publisher is an official imprint of one of the big 5 versus just being distributed by them, because a lot of big presses actually take small ones under their wings and distribute for them, and they take like a percentage of the profits. So while they aren't like, that small publisher isn't an imprint of, say, like Penguin Random House, they're distributed by them. So it helps them get like more distribution and wider coverage and stuff. They're still in charge of everything on their own. It's just they have like a big one kind of helping them along. So anyway, if someone is an official imprint, though, like they were bought out by one of the big 5, then I consider that a large press. And then if they're just distributed by one, they're still medium or small press. So I read 35% of my books were from a big 5 or a big 5 imprint. 24% were small presses. That's like very small, you know, like very small teams, like 5-people teams kind of thing. 25% were medium presses, like Angry Robot would be a medium press. And then 16% were indie or like small self-published. So I think that's pretty cool, because that shows like 65 out of 99 of my books were from small, medium, and self-published authors, which I think is great, because the big 5 really do dominate the market, and sometimes they just pump out just like swill, like Colleen Hoover. Oh my god. Anyway, what's next? The publishers that I read. So I found this interesting. This is only publishers that I read more of 2 of. So there's a lot that I read 2 of, like Berkeley Books, Bindery Books, Del Rey, Orbit, stuff like that. And then I read DAW. I read 7 DAW books, and they auto-approved me on on NetGalley, so I'm so excited about that. Angry Robot, only read 4 of theirs. They sent out their list this year, but then it took a while to like get the titles from them. I don't know if they had like a changeover or something in their marketing department, but anyway, it's fine. I'm auto-approved for them on NetGalley too, but they did a lot of series, like book 2s and 3s this year, I think, at least from what I saw. And so I didn't read the first one, so I was like, well, no. I read 3 from Clash. I read 5 from Tor.com. A few from Tor Nightfire and Tor, which are all kind of the same thing. And then a couple from 3 Laser books, and then 3 from Solaris. So yeah, it looks like DAW was the fave publisher this year, so that's good for you. What are we at next? Next we have genres. So it's always surprising me. I always feel like I'm not reading enough sci-fi, and then I look at my stats, and I'm like, oh, I read 38 sci-fis this year. So yeah, I read 38 sci-fis, 3 romances, 4 poetry collections, 3 nonfictions, 1 thriller, 19 horror books. So horror is coming in second, which is funny because I feel like I'm reading so much fantasy, but I only read 15 fantasy compared to the sci-fi and the horror, so I don't know. 6 historical fiction and 10 contemporary novels. I read a lot more contemporary novels than last year because of the fact that I was getting them from these Canadian small prices, and they publish a lot of that, so that's kind of good because, I like contemporary books once in a while. And then we have the subgenres. So this is anything that's the subgenre of those previous ones. So like, for example, classic sci-fi, that's a subgenre. Lit fiction, I had some of my sci-fis were lit fiction, there was a horror lit fiction, you know what I mean? So, and all of these are the subgenres of. So 4 horrors, 3 gothic, 4 fantasy, 3 cozy, 2 eco-fiction, 2 historical fiction, 2 magical realism, 6 mysteries, 2 romances, and 2 sci-fis. So like there would be like a fantasy sci-fi or like a fantasy romance. So versus romantasy, which is something else. You can watch my video about the difference between romantasy and fantasy and romantic fantasy if you want. You can find it in my feed. I found it kind of fun. I added a new one this year, and this is setting. So where were the books taking place? 2 were unknown. I don't, like Spread Me, for example, doesn't tell you exactly where that's set. It was just like a desert. 8 were set in Canada, yay. 1 in Australia, 1 in Antarctica, 1 in hell, 1 in the ocean, and 1 on the moon. So some very wild places there. 3 were in Eastern Europe, 3 were in Western Europe, 2 were in the Philippines. 16 were in a fantasy world. 4 were in NA, which isn't the same as unknown. It's just like, I think those were the poetry collections. 10 were in a sci-fi world. 8 were in space, which is different from the moon, I guess. And then 5 were in the UK. And then, of course, a whopping 29 were set in the United States. But, a majority of books tend to be set in the United States. So I can't really avoid that, though I'm not traveling there right now for various reasons. Okay, so point of view. I can't remember if I did this last year, but this year I read 72 third person point of views because I prefer third person way more to first person. I still read 14 first persons. I read 2 that were mixed, that had a mix of first and third, and I read 11 that I can't remember. So I really need to be better at keeping my charts because I had to spend 4 hours or something the last week going through and adding all of the stats to my spreadsheet because I didn't do it when I was doing my reviews. So I really need to do this because it's very annoying. It takes so long. So anyway, and I forget. 11, I forget. I looked and I'm like, wait a second. Was this in first or third? I honestly don't know. And I was like, I'm not going to go back and look. Too lazy. Okay, so this is something fun. So this part I find fascinating. This is like the demographics of the characters and stuff. So this year, of the books that I read, 56 characters were white, and 25 were people of color, or there were multiple MCs with one or a few of them being people of color, and 18 were aliens, animals, or it was never stated what their background was. So last year, when I also read 99 books, 54 were white, so this hasn't really changed much. In terms of the main characters' gender identity, 44 of the main characters this year were women and 23 were men, versus last year when 62 were women and 20 were men. But this year I had 10 books more with a collection of MCs. So I think this year I had 28 with a mixture of main characters where you had 1 man, 1 woman, or whatever. But last year I only had 10. So that kind of evens that out a bit. And then this year I had 2 non-binary characters, same as last year. Apparently that's my average for non-binary character. This year, in terms of sexual identity, 29 of the main characters were queer, with 54 were cishet. This is almost the same as last year, which is wild, where I had 30 queer MCs and 66 cishet. But this year, I had more multiple MCs where 1 or more of the group were queer, and 8 where it wasn't applicable or mentioned. So I think overall, there's more. What's really interesting this year is that there's been an increase in queer normativity in the world building, which I found great, either with having side characters as queer or the world building that has queer people in the background. So 54 of the books specified this. They specified this by including characters or mentioning it, versus 35 that did not, and 10 where it wasn't clear or wasn't really applicable, like some of the poetry. Last year, only 42 had clearly queer normative settings. So that's a really kind of big jump from 1 year. It could be the books that I'm reading, but I think it's just almost like a societal thing. We're just including people of different backgrounds versus, even 10 years ago when that would have been seen as progressive just to include a queer couple, where now it's the side characters' parents are queer. Okay, good. Now, moving on to the authors themselves. So, I want to read more books by people of diverse backgrounds. I just get so many books from NetGalley, and most of the time that information is not included, so I will learn later that I'm reading another, like, cishet white person. Likewise, my 8 to 10 classic sci-fis I read a year are primarily white people, so that sucks away like 10% of the books as well. I did read more wildly this year, as last year 74 of the authors were white, so I've actually improved this because 60% of the authors were white this year, with 22 being unknown and 16 obvious people of color due to their bio or their author photo. And that's the thing too, it's unsure. A lot of this is unsure because if they don't specifically state it in their bio or they don't have a picture of themselves, I don't know. In terms of gender or sex, 53 of the authors identified as women, 41 men, and 4 were non-binary, and 1 was an anthology with a bunch of people. This isn't a lot different from last year, actually, and it seems men are still writing female main characters, or they'll have a mix of them. Like, for example, The Devils and Grave Empire, both written by men, have very good female characters. And so this is something that I noticed, that there's a lot of men writing women characters, which is good, because it seems like while there are a lot of men who write women characters badly, there are a lot more men writing women characters that have great depth and aren't just, focusing on boobily walking down the stairs. Lastly, and this is the hardest stat to get, is people don't often list this in their bio. Either they want to keep it to themselves, which is totally fair. They're afraid of persecution, or they are, queer but in a cishet relationship and don't need to mention it in their bio. So I try not to assume that people in cishet relationships listed in their, they list they have kids and a husband or whatever, weren't queer. But it's very hard to know, obviously. So 38 were completely unknown. 40 seemed cishet. Again, how many of them were bi or pan is unknown as well. And 20 said that they were queer outright in their bios. Last year I didn't even do this for the authors because it's kind of pointless. But I was thinking about this year and I was like, well, it's kind of interesting to show that we only had 20 openly queer authors, at least in the books that I read. There were normalized queer worlds in 54 of them, so double. So that shows a lot of allyship, which I think is really good. And there were 10 more openly queer main characters than there were queer authors. So I just think that's a really interesting trend. I don't really know. I think it's a good trend. I don't know how much of what it actually says kind of like in a macro point of view, but from the books that I read, it just seems like there's a lot more queer normativity, and I think that's a great thing, and that's a positive thing to go into 2026. I wish I had been doing this 10 years ago, because I bet this would have looked very different back then, and it would have been cool to see like the trend. So maybe I'll just keep doing this for another 10 years and we'll see, and hopefully this doesn't backtrack. Yeah, so those are my stats for 2025. I'm going to keep tracking them into 2026. And I hope you have a wonderful new year. And I hope you have some great books on your roster to read in the new year. So thanks. Bye.